Brother made my life hell, then got my wife pregnant. Now he wants my help after our parents disowned him and left me their $2 million inheritance. My younger brother, David, has always harbored a deep-seated resentment towards me. If you think it stemmed from jealousy, you'd be wrong. He was the favored child, not me. There was no reason for him to be envious. To give you some context, our mother always indulged David. He was the golden child of our family. She cooked his meals, did his laundry, and even asked me to help him with his schoolwork. I was expected to assist him simply because we were family, but I never received the same consideration. I accepted this, as I was quite independent. Perhaps it was partly my fault for always meeting his needs without expecting anything in return. He never helped me when I needed it and only approached me when he wanted something. While I was a quiet, introverted kid who enjoyed studying and keeping to myself, he was loud and rough, just like our dad. I also tend to be straightforward and honest, never sugarcoating things. I believe my mother may have developed a negative perception of me because of my straightforwardness. This favoritism made David the family's darling, and I didn't mind it while we were growing up. However, problems began when he started bullying and mocking me for being different from him. He would tease me about my height and the fact that I wore glasses. He would sneak into my room, read my diary, and then complain to my mom about what I had written. When I yelled at him and complained to our parents about him invading my privacy, they would laugh it off, saying it wasn't a big deal. He did more awful things, like nearly breaking my glasses and putting nasty things in my food. He even once put little stones in my cereal, but luckily I found them before they could damage my teeth. When I told my mom, she dismissed it, saying, "This is how brothers bond." Whenever we fought, David would zero in on my insecurities to insult me. We went to the same school, so he knew I was being bullied by a few kids. Instead of supporting me, he sided with the bullies, calling me names like ugly loser or hairy monkey, and encouraging them to physically harm me, saying I was just a big failure. Another time, during a fight over something trivial that I can't even remember, he told me to kill myself. While I could easily brush off most insults, that one really hurt because I was struggling with my mental health at the time. I'm doing better now, but it was devastating to hear that my own brother wanted me dead. Since Dad was often at work and Mom didn't seem to care much, she even scolded me once, claiming it was my fault for irritating him. Things progressively worsened during high school. There was a shocking incident when David attempted to set my hair on fire, and unbelievably, our mother defended him, claiming he was merely playing. Seriously, who behaves like that? Thankfully, my dad eventually sided with me and pointed out the gravity of the situation. He even threatened to call the police on David. This moment was a real eye-opener for my brother, as he had never faced any consequences for his actions before. He was genuinely stunned, and my dad made it clear that enough was enough and that David needed to start respecting his older brother. Later, Dad came into my room to talk. I never expected his support because he always told David how similar they were, which was true. Dad admitted that he had waited for years, hoping David would mature, but he was slowly realizing that David was becoming a big bully. Hearing this from my dad was incredibly validating, and I almost broke down in tears. I confessed everything David had done to me over the years and even mentioned the bullying at school. My dad was shocked at how much I had endured. The next day, he spoke to the principal to ensure the bullies were warned about severe consequences if they continued. Later that evening, Dad enrolled me in MMA at our local gym, telling me I needed to man up and stand up to bullies in my life. I admit that a nerdy kid like me trying to learn to fight might have seemed laughable, but I was very focused. I managed my time well to balance my studies and daily workouts, and the MMA classes completely changed my life and physique. One day, David was up to his antics again. He stole my pocket money, which we received for helping with chores. I had been saving it for a while. David sneaked into my room and took it. I caught him Just as he was about to cycle off with his friends, I demanded he return my money, but David mocked me, saying all I could do was run to Daddy for help. I don't know what came over me, but I punched him in the face. He was stunned, fell backward, and I retrieved my money from his pocket before throwing him back down. David started crying loudly, which was quite comical. However, my mother rushed out to help him and find out what happened. When she learned I had fought him, she was surprised and reprimanded me, saying I should be a better role model for David, who seemed to enjoy seeing me scolded. My mother also complained to my dad about my behavior, saying I needed to be controlled. My dad grimly asked both of us to explain ourselves. I told him how David had stolen the money I had worked hard for and saved, while David tried to justify it by saying he needed the money for a date and that, as his brother, I should help him. However, Dad told David he was lucky I only punched him for stealing because anyone else would have called the police. He continued to tell David that he had no right to take other people's things without their consent. David didn't like that and threw a tantrum, likely hoping our mother would side with him. But Dad remained firm. When David realized he wasn't going to be punished for being hit, he screamed how much he hated me and ran back to his room, locking himself in. Following that incident, David began to distance himself from me. He had finally understood that he couldn't bully me anymore and that even Dad had stopped supporting his antics. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we were equals. Though he could no longer physically harm me, he resorted to verbal insults when our parents weren't around. His behavior worsened with age, becoming angrier and more short-tempered each year. When I approached him with a question, he would ignore me and walk away, muttering insults like nerd or loser under his breath. If he needed to communicate something, he would relay it through our mother instead of speaking to me directly. When I questioned her about why David couldn't just talk to me, she would urge me to be more understanding. I couldn't tell if it was just puberty or genuine hatred. Over time, dealing with his comments became unbearable, and I longed to move out and get away from him. I repeatedly asked my mother to mediate a sit-down conversation for us to resolve our issues, but she always refused, saying she didn't want to get involved. When I asked her opinion on why David treated me this way, she would brush off the question. Eventually, I left for my dream university, having earned a scholarship as a top student. My dad threw a party for me, and even my mom seemed proud. However, David remained aloof and distant, barely acknowledging my achievements. The day I left for university was a mix of excitement for the future and relief to escape the toxic home environment. The first few months at university were liberating. I made new friends, enjoyed my classes, and started to build a life separate from the oppressive atmosphere of my childhood. The constant fear of David's verbal attacks lifted, giving me a newfound sense of peace. During my second year, I met my wife, Karen, at a frat party through a friend, and we immediately clicked. Coming from a religious background, having kids outside of marriage was frowned upon. However, when we discovered she was pregnant in our final year, we decided to marry right after graduation. Our wedding was a small but joyful ceremony. Our parents were happy for us, and we enjoyed the celebration. At that moment, I believed Karen was the love of my life. I had always envisioned a monogamous relationship, one woman to come home to and share my life with. Despite other women showing interest over the years, I never pursued anything because I was genuinely content in my marriage. Karen was my dream girl, and I never wanted to hurt her. However, I later uncovered two incidents of infidelity in our marriage. One was an intermittent affair with her married co-worker that spanned several years, and the other was a brief fling with an ex-boyfriend during a visit to her family. Some might think I was naive, and looking back, I can't completely disagree. Each time we separated for a while, I chose to forgive my wife. I didn't want to raise our child in a broken home and believed we could overcome these obstacles. The affair with her coworker happened when we were young, and I attributed it to youthful mistakes and poor judgment. For a period, things seemed to get better. Although I could never fully trust her again, I did my best to set aside my doubts. Karen seemed to have changed, and we were genuinely happy, planning our family's future. However, 3 months ago, my world was shattered once more when she revealed that she had been having a long-term affair and suggested that our son might not be mine. Her words struck me like a ton of bricks. A mix of shock, betrayal, and disbelief overwhelmed me. I struggled to comprehend the enormity of her confession. In a daze, I managed to ask why she had kept such a significant secret and how she could have done something so devastating. Her reaction was cold and indifferent, as if she were detached from the pain she caused. Her vague responses left me with more questions than answers. It was a surreal and painful moment. Confronting the shattered trust and uncertainty about my own family, I continued to press Karen for the truth because I felt I deserved to know the father of the child I had been raising since birth. Ultimately, she admitted it was David. My eyes widened in shock as I asked Karen what she meant. She explained that she and David had become friends when I introduced her to my family, and she stayed with us from Thanksgiving until New Year's. David, usually cold to me, was warm and polite towards her, which made me glad because I didn't want Karen to feel unwelcome. Karen wanted to be accepted into my family, so she spent significant time with my mom whenever possible. She noticed the rift between David and me and questioned me about it. I opened up about our strained relationship and explained that we might never repair it due to his unresolved feelings. Karen understood but started including David in our outings, hoping it would help us bond. Whenever we planned to watch a movie, she invited David, and we watched whatever he chose. During this time, David and I exchanged a few words, which was an improvement compared to his usual silent treatment. I remember Karen and David hanging out and playing video games together, but I never thought much of it. Karen told me that one day David opened up to her about his struggles in a recent breakup. Feeling vulnerable, he struck up a friendship with her. She mentioned that he would harmlessly flirt with her when I wasn't around, and eventually, things escalated beyond her control. The vision of my wife and brother sleeping together made me feel sick. Karen confessed that she felt guilty afterward and left him, which matched her abrupt decision to go home instead of spending New Year's with me. Although I tried to convince her to stay, she was adamant about leaving. When we met back at college after the holidays, she was her usual cheerful self, so I didn't question anything. 2 weeks later, we found out she was pregnant. Karen admitted she didn't know if the child was mine or David's, and with no way to prove it, she chose to stay with me, knowing I was the more dependable brother. This was why we got married. My world felt like it was crashing down. The son I loved might not even be mine. I asked Karen if she had been sleeping with David recently, and she slowly nodded. She revealed that they had always stayed in touch because their chemistry was undeniable. They would sneak off to hotels, lying to me about working overtime. She admitted that half of her business trips were actually romantic getaways with him. I asked why she married me if she wanted my brother, and Karen said she didn't want to be the one to break off the marriage. She saw me as a wonderful father to our son and decided to stay. In her words, she made a mistake and didn't know when to stop. I told Karen I was glad she told me the truth, but that I was going to pack up and leave. She started crying, asking for forgiveness, and expected me to yell at her. Instead, I calmly packed my clothes. Karen insisted that if I loved her, I should fight for her, and that mistakes happen in every marriage. When she realized I wasn't going to do anything, she changed tactics, saying our son would be affected by a divorce and that children shouldn't be raised in broken homes. I reminded her that I might not even be the father, which made her cry more and accuse me of being cruel. It seemed like she believed nothing could make me want to leave the marriage. Perhaps it was partly my fault for letting things slide in the past. While I did love her, it felt more like it stemmed from thinking we had a son together and had been together since college. Karen kept insisting it wasn't too late to fix things, but I struggled to believe her and had no patience left. Trust was a major issue, and her words felt hollow. Even if I forgave her, I could never forget she slept with my brother. I've always believed in forgiving mistakes because we're all flawed, but this was beyond acceptable limits. I left her crying on the doorstep and checked into a hotel. The next day, I went straight to my parents and revealed everything about my wife's affair with David, explaining how they had been secretly sleeping together for years. The shock on their faces was undeniable. True to her nature, my mother initially tried to defend David, insisting that her boy could never do such a thing to his own brother. Determined to expose the truth, I asked my parents to remain silent and let me call David in front of them. I instructed them to stay quiet so I could catch David off guard, making him believe it was a private conversation. When David answered the phone, I confronted him about the affair. At first, he vehemently denied it, refusing to accept any responsibility. However, when I told him that Karen had admitted to everything, he started blaming her, calling her characterless. He claimed it wasn't his fault if women were attracted to him and that he was the better-looking brother. I told him firmly that I would expose him to everyone. When David mocked me, saying no one would believe me because he was the golden child, I scoffed at his arrogance and thanked him for confirming the truth, knowing our parents had heard everything. David went quiet and then spluttered, trying to explain himself and salvage his image. My mother, still in shock, demanded an explanation from David. He stuttered through a feeble attempt to justify his actions, blaming everyone else but himself and desperately trying to shift the blame onto Karen. I could see my mother, who had once been protective of her favored son, now felt a mix of disappointment and anger. In that charged moment, I felt a strange sense of vindication. For years, I had endured David's torment. Now the truth was out, and the roles were reversed. It was David who stood exposed, his actions laid bare for everyone to see. As David's words faltered, my father, usually reserved in his expressions, couldn't contain his disappointment. He asked me to pass him the phone and began to speak to David. David, my father began, his voice laden with disappointment. What you've done isn't just a betrayal of your brother, but a betrayal of this family. You slept with your brother's wife and continued the affair even after they were married. Your actions have severe consequences and have irreversibly shattered the trust we had in you. I raised both of you to value family loyalty and decency. What you've shown today defies everything I've tried to teach you. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink into David's conscience. Your disregard for your brother's feelings and the lack of respect for his marriage are unacceptable. You've not only hurt him, but also torn apart the bonds that hold our family together. Your mother and I are partly to blame for what you've become, but we will no longer tolerate this behavior. From today, you're cut off from the college funds I set up for you. You'll have to figure out how to pay your university fees on your own. I will also stop funding your lifestyle. Do you think it makes you more of a man to sleep with married women? Let's see how you manage without my money. Throughout this, I maintained a composed demeanor. Although I initially wanted to scream at David, watching my dad punish him was the ultimate vindication. I had exposed his true nature, and it was clear he had underestimated the consequences. My mother, despite David's persistent protests, continued to justify him, but my father swiftly ended the call, shutting down David's attempts to explain away his actions. Afterward, my mom approached me and hugged me. It had been a long time since we shared such a moment, but in that embrace, there was an unspoken understanding and support amid the family turmoil. She apologized for not believing me all this time. My 14-year-old self could never have imagined this moment being vindicated and embraced by my mother. Following this, my dad helped me find a good lawyer to divorce Karen. She and her lawyer tried to fight dirty, asking for alimony since I earned more than her. But her affair played heavily in my favor. We also conducted a paternity test, and it was confirmed that David was indeed the father of the child. The news was incredibly painful, even worse than discovering Karen's infidelity. I was furious that the son I had loved and raised wasn't mine. However, I decided to stay strong. Karen begged me to continue visiting my son, arguing he shouldn't be punished for the situation. But I couldn't bear to see him, He reminded me too much of David, and I hated it. After my divorce was finalized, I felt a sense of freedom wash over me as I moved into my own bachelor pad. It felt surreal to live alone since I had married so young and never really had the chance to experience independence. However, my naturally independent nature allowed me to quickly adapt to my new lifestyle, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. 2 weeks ago, my dad called to tell me he was considering changing his will because he didn't want to leave anything to David. My dad is incredibly stubborn, and once he decided to cut David out of his life, he stuck to it. David tried reaching out to our parents and even showed up at their doorstep, begging for forgiveness, but they refused to let him in. Even my mother, who usually gave in to David's tantrums, seemed done with him, though it must have been hardest for her. David never texted me to apologize for what he had done, showing he didn't regret his actions. He was just upset about being cut off from our parents. Dad told me he planned to leave everything to me, ensuring David wouldn't contest it later. He would leave David only $1. My eyes widened in shock as my dad had worked hard his entire life, including his assets, retirement fund, and life insurance. The total came to nearly $2 million. The only condition in his will was that if my dad passed away before my mom, she would continue living in their house, even though ownership would transfer to me. I didn't mind this, as I wanted to care for my mom in her final days. Somehow, David found out about this and, unable to reach our parents, called me yesterday, trying to make amends. He explained how he was struggling with college and that after Corinne discovered the paternity of the child, she had been pestering him for child support. He said he had no money and was looking for part-time jobs but couldn't find anything. He begged me to talk to our family to start fresh since he really needed my help. I laughed in his face and told him I was done with him. I reminded him that he should have thought about the consequences before sleeping with my wife and getting her pregnant. David argued that I was being unfair and that Corinne was also to blame, to which I agreed. I reminded him that I had divorced her, making her his responsibility now. He shouldn't be calling me to complain about her or the child, as these were the consequences of his own actions. David started to raise his voice, but I interrupted, reminding him that he was no longer the favored child in the family, but the black sheep who had slept with his own brother's wife. At that moment, David began to cry, telling me how everyone, including our grandparents and relatives, had turned against him. While this was true, it was no longer my concern. I told him we were done and that he should never call me again, as I no longer considered him my brother. Since then, I've replayed the conversation in my mind. Despite my hatred for my brother, I had never heard him cry, at least not since we were kids. I won't lie, it did hurt me a bit to see him so helpless. So I guess I'm here to ask if I should talk to our parents about him, or if I would be an asshole if I don't. Hi, everyone. Many of you have been asking why I am no longer in contact with my son, Henry, and some have even called me cruel. I need to explain that I am not comfortable raising another man's child. This isn't a stepson situation. I was led to believe Henry was my son, only to later discover he is actually my brother David's son. Naturally, this revelation hurt deeply, and I cried over it for days. The main reason I don't want any contact with Henry is that I no longer want Corinne in my life. If I remain connected to her child, she will find a way to re-enter my life, and I need my space. You may think I'm cruel or selfish, but I can't see him ever again, at least not for a very long time. Update 2. Most of you correctly guessed that it was my mother who informed David about my dad changing his will, leading David to call me as a last resort to fix things. I confronted her in front of my dad, and she broke down, saying I had punished David enough and that he had learned his lesson. My dad firmly told my mother that if she believed what David did was forgivable, then he could no longer stay married to her because he could never forgive such a betrayal. This threat silenced my mother. My dad made it clear that if she ever talked with David again and we found out, she could pack her bags and leave. As I mentioned, my dad is very stubborn. Hopefully, my mother will learn from her mistakes. Update 3. Reddit. It's been 5 months since my last update. My relationship with my parents has improved over the past few months. My dad and I go golfing every weekend, and he treats me more like a buddy than a son. Although my mother misses David, she has stayed away from him. The last I heard about David was from my cousin, who said David had been asking everyone for money and eventually had to drop out of college because he couldn't afford the fees. He and Karen are living together, and he has a part-time job as a mechanic. Apparently, they are raising Henry together, which is a good thing, I guess. I never discuss David with my parents, and they don't bring him up either. For everyone asking, I am doing quite well. I was promoted at my job 2 months ago, so my salary has significantly improved. I haven't been dating anyone, as I feel I still need time and space to heal. I've been going to therapy, so we'll see how that works out. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you. My wife cheated with my stepbrother, got pregnant, and I told her parents. Now she's cut off from her inheritance. I 34 meters and my wife 29F have been married for 2 years. Our relationship has been rather ordinary. We met at a work event many years ago, became friends for a few years, then realized we had feelings for one another and began dating. We dated for 3 years before I asked her to marry me. So, we've been together for about 6 years. We never had any issues either while courting or after we married. She is gorgeous, intelligent, and a wonderful partner for me. I have done my best to be a good husband to her, and we are happy together. Around 6 months ago, my stepbrother Darren, 28 meters, was sacked from his work. Instead of looking for another career, he opted to spend some time traveling and finding himself. Darren has always been unpredictable and spontaneous. My parents had a difficult time convincing him to go to college and earn a degree. He is constantly full of wacky ideas that he needs to be talked out of, but being dismissed from his job because he was intoxicated during a business meeting is serious. Despite his history, he resolved to quit drinking. Despite my fears that he would abandon this project halfway through, I attempted to be supportive for my father's sake. My parents divorced while I was a child, and my father married Darren's mother when I was a teenager. So, when Darren asked if he could stay at my house for a few weeks to tour New York, I wasn't sure how to say no. I was suspicious and unwilling to do it, but when my father and stepmother urged me to let him stay, I couldn't say no. I questioned my wife, and she said she was fine with it, so I grudgingly gave in. Darren came to live with us 2 months ago. I made it clear that he could not bring anyone into the flat and that even if he could leave and return any time he pleased, it should not disrupt our sleep. Surprisingly, he agreed with all of my rules. For the first few days, he stayed out virtually all night, and I even saw him arrive as late as 7 a.m., when I was already up and preparing for work. Aside from that, he was fairly polite, having supper with me and my wife at our home and even cooking for us on a few occasions. I was pleasantly surprised. This was not the Darren I'd known my entire life. My wife and I had scheduled a weekend trip to Vegas the second weekend Darren was staying with us because I had worked there. We told Darren to take care of the place until we returned. Everything was planned, but my wife developed a severe stomach flu at the last minute. It was Thursday night, and we were meant to leave the next morning. We were both really unhappy, but we assumed she would go if she felt better. Unfortunately, her illness worsened the next morning, and by the time we were scheduled to depart, she was too ill to travel. I tried to reschedule my job commitment and postpone our trip, but it was too late, and I needed to travel. I felt terrible about leaving her in that state, but I knew Darren would be there in case her health worsened. He offered to stay at home and cook her meals as well. I vowed to return as early as possible on Saturday morning and then left. Looking back, I can't believe I didn't see that coming. So, I went to Vegas by myself, returned the next day, and found that my wife was doing better. I didn't think much of it at the time, but after that weekend, I noticed Darren was home more frequently than usual. Previously, he went out every day, but now he hasn't left the flat in several days. I asked whether everything was fine, and he just shrugged, claiming he was trying to save his money. I didn't think much of it at first, but as time passed, I began to notice more things that stood out. When I returned from work one day, I discovered that my wife had already arrived home. Apparently, she had taken a half-day off due to a headache and forgot to notify me. Another day, I arrived home early and noticed Darren and my wife entering the house together. They stated that they had just met outside the building. This could just be a coincidence, but I had a horrible feeling about it. I had never questioned my wife's devotion before, and while Darren was a messy person, I didn't think he could do something so heinous as that. Still, I couldn't ignore the impression that something was off. I knew I couldn't accuse them of anything without evidence, and doing so would cause upheaval in my family, which I wasn't prepared to cope with. So, I took a straightforward approach. I asked Darren how long he planned on staying with us. I reminded him that, while it was fantastic to have him around, he should think about his future moves. Thankfully, he caught the message and stated he'd be leaving within a week. My wife was in the room during the chat, but she said nothing, which made me uneasy. Darren moved out, and I attempted to ignore my misgivings, concentrating on my marriage rather than worrying about the worst-case situation. Things improved after he departed. Ed and I began to believe I had been overly paranoid. I was mortified to think that my wife would do something like that, especially because she had been the perfect spouse all these years. However, around 2 weeks ago, something happened. We discovered that my wife was pregnant 2 months, to be exact. You probably know where this is headed. When Darren moved in with us 2 months ago, I felt sick to my stomach. I'll offer you some context. I am a few years older than my wife. As I previously stated, by the time I was 30, I was ready to settle down and establish my own family. When my wife and I first started dating, I knew she was the one for me and wanted to marry her. However, she believed she was too young to have children and wanted to wait a few years before making that decision. Though it wasn't what I desired, I approved of her choice. We always took precautions since we decided to wait until she was 30 to start looking for children. My wife always insisted we'd be very careful since her body reacts poorly to hormonal birth control, and she is not on any tablets. I also always used protection. Accidents do happen, of course, but I could not get over the sense that something was off. I felt the timing to be unsettling. She said she wanted to keep the baby, that although this was unplanned, it was a good thing and we ought to be glad. Long since I had desired children under different conditions. I would have been ecstatic, but instead, I was in excruciating pain. Though I attempted to seem content to my wife, I don't think I have ever felt worse, uncertain of what to do. I wanted no one to criticize me. Thus, I couldn't talk to any of my friends about it. Nevertheless, I couldn't get rid of the bad ideas and emotions. I knew I couldn't continue living in total anguish. After about 1 week, I had to face my bride. I knew this would have a terrible effect on our marriage, and should I turn out to be mistaken, she might never pardon me, but I kept thinking of the worst. The prospect of her carrying the baby of my stepbrother made me sick. After our first visit, completed several blood tests and procedures, all I could feel was total devastation. I decided to talk to her as I could no longer handle it, got ready for the worst. I told her I had to talk to her about something quite crucial happened about a week ago. During supper, she wanted to know straight away, though afraid. I aimed to be as direct as I could. I apologized for feeling this way, but I questioned her whether she actually carried my child. My question seemed to startle her. Her whole face flushed red, and she began shouting, accusing me of being a monster for questioning her and committing something so terrible. She said she had never strayed from me. She wondered where all this was coming from. and I told her it was too much of a coincidence. She was 2 months pregnant, the same length of time Darren had left. She became much more irate as a result and began yelling even more. Seeing the situation becoming bad, I tried to cool her down and get her to pay attention to me. I told her it hurt for me to live with these uncertainties. I told her about the events that occurred during Darren's stay, wishing I had no harbor of uncertainty and felt something was off. She seemed to relax a little and assured me she knew I had questions, but she also advised me to believe her and our marriage would be stronger. Though I felt awful, I told her I wished I could just ignore these ideas, having attempted. I wanted a paternity test following the birth. If there was really nothing to worry about, I even said I knew how tough this must be for her, but I had to be sure for my own peace of mind. If she was angry before the reference to a paternity test, she sent her off. She said I was nasty and she couldn't believe I would force her to go through something so embarrassing over my crazy thoughts. Though I attempted to remain cool, really seeing her sue against the concept made me feel as though my suspicions were vindicated, and I started to get enraged. I told her this was an ultimatum. If she disagreed, I doubted we could be together. She admitted she needed time to consider it, and this seemed to help her somewhat relax. That evening, we slept in different rooms. We said nothing to one another. The next morning, before reporting to work, I fantasized the worst-case scenario as the truth all day. The remainder of the week reflected that she would ignore me and arrive home late at night. She grew upset every time I tried to chat to her, so I finally gave up. I had no notion she was merely deciding on her next action. When I got up in the morning last Thursday, I discovered she had not returned home the evening before. She never responded when I texted her many times. I had to report to work, but I was so agitated that I couldn't concentrate and so left early for home. I waited hours for her, but I grew rather concerned when she still hadn't returned home by 9 p.m. and would not answer my calls. Not sure what else to do, I asked her assistant at work about her. My surprise was that she hadn't been to work and had taken to personal days. Her assistant expressed amazement at my ignorance of this. I was somewhat concerned at that point and phoned some of her friends to see whether she was with any of them. I started picturing the worst when all of them claimed they hadn't heard from her. I fretted about her leaving me or about something happening to her. I asked my mother-in-law as a last resort whether she was with her. She wasn't, but upon learning my wife had vanished for 2 days, my mill started to get really concerned. She promised to try to get to her and let me know whether there was any update, should she still be inaccessible. We agreed to phone 911. I was completely terrified in the next half hour, but suddenly my wife called. She stated she was absolutely fine, wanted some time to sort things out, and that I had no need to stress her out for no cause or involve her mother. She sounded even angry, very apathetic. I became enraged when she showed no regard for freaking me out, but I calmed down and asked her where she was and when she was returning. She hung up, then declared she would be returning early the next morning. Afraid and somewhat angry, I went to bed. I considered spending some time apart from her. I had no idea what lay ahead of me. The next morning, she woke me up and seemed especially content. She stated she was fixing a problem. When I asked her where she had been the day before, trust me when I say I spent weeks considering every conceivable scenario that might go wrong. What she said next was crazier than anything I could have imagined. She explained that this pregnancy was killing our marriage and causing foolish questions in my head. Hence, she decided to rescue our marriage by means of an abortion. She met my eyes squarely and stated, now I had no reason to question her loyalty. We could start our marriage anew. I looked astounded. I had never used that word and really meant it before in my life. I simply asked her if she was kidding. After just staring at her, she stated she was totally serious and hoped I could unwind now and stop allowing stupid worries to disturb me anymore. More than that served as my breaking point. After several more minutes of staring at her, I stood up and departed. Spending another second with her worried me that I would have some kind of mental collapse, She started to follow me, but if she wanted peace, I advised her to avoid me. I guess my tone was severe enough to stop her. I phoned my attorney on the way out of the building to let her know I was divorcing my wife and needed to start the process immediately. I also scheduled a meeting for the following morning and advised her we had to make sure my wife missed a penny of my money. Though I had no idea exactly how things would turn out, I knew what I had to do. I asked Darren where he was when I phoned. He claimed to be in Atlanta someplace. I asked him not to waste my time, simply admit that they had slept together. I was divorcing my wife. He said nothing for a few minutes, then simply apologized to me. That helped me too. I understood there was nothing else to say for the evening. I checked into a hotel and got ready for what I knew was in store. I woke up the next morning, headed straight to my attorney, and gave her all the specifics, the infidelity, the abortion, everything. She claimed that we did have a shot, even though it's tough to have a clean divorce with no alimony unless both sides come to a mutual understanding. As my wife has a high-paying job of her own and is most certainly the one at fault here. Really, I was more concerned with the cause than with the money. With this woman, I was finished. She could be very frigid, which astounded me. It seemed like I had lived all these years among strangers. The person I loved and married would not be able to do anything this crazy. She had slept with my stepbrother, but there was still a possibility she was pregnant with my baby. Now, we would never know. Changing my plans to suit her wants and doing everything I could to be a decent husband. After almost 6 years in this marriage, this is what I received. Inquiring whether she was at work, I phoned her assistant. She became ... I urged her not to tell my wife. I phoned and lied about arranging a surprise for her. I then headed home, loaded as many of her items as I could into 3 suitcases, and arranged them in the hall. Changing our locks and phoning a locksmith came next. I wanted no sight of her. I wanted her out of my house, gone, not wanting to be home when she got back. I then stuffed some of my own items in an overnight bag and headed back to my hotel. It was almost 5 p.m. By the time everything was finished, and I was worn out, physically and psychologically, I slept on the bed and nodded out as soon as I got to my motel. My phone rang when I woke up. In fact, it was my wife, but I chose to treat her with the same indifference that she had shown me the day she obtained the abortion behind my back. She persisted in phoning, and I ignored a million books that she recommended regarding all that. I had nothing to say to her. She stopped at last. After over an hour of unrelenting calls, she had apparently given up. But then I received a text from Darren stating she had contacted him and inquired as to whether I had spoken with him. It was finished. He informed her I knew everything, again over text. He apologized. I couldn't care less, not texting him either. I started considering what to do next. The following phase was where I might have gone a little too far, but I was devastated and embarrassed. What else to do eluded me. One thing you should know about my wife is that she is from a quite traditional Southern background. They do things a particular way over there, and since we were married, she has been under pressure to have children. I had been on her side at every family gathering for years, helping to back our slow approach. I never once said that her desire to wait was the sole reason we weren't trying for children. I knew that her family would not be very happy if they discovered she had an abortion and cheated. I thus decided to phone my mother-in-law and simply be petty once in a lifetime. I gently went over everything with her and advised her that I was divorcing her daughter for betraying my confidence. She first doubted me and sounded embarrassed about the abortion. I could show her the positive pregnancy test and the doctor's notes from our first appointment. Darren had previously acknowledged the affair. She may have her daughter clarify the rest. My wife was blowing up my phone in no time, exactly as I had anticipated. I tried to wait it out, but I ultimately picked up when she wouldn't stop after an hour and a half of unrelenting calling. Her answer was as predicted. She screamed I was ruining her life for no reason, and she had nowhere to stay for the evening. She was beyond enraged. I informed her she was welcome to check into any hotel of her choice, but not to irritate me. I disregarded her attempts to prod me. She would be hearing from my lawyer shortly, and any correspondence from now on would go via our lawyers. I advised her. I also assured her that I would pack and deliver everything she desired wherever. She then told me she could forget about ever inheriting a cent from her parents, since her parents were quite enraged with her and declared she was no longer welcome in their family. From my in-laws, this was surprising. Although I expected them to be enraged, I did not believe they would act in this extreme manner. I obviously told my wife none of this. Rather, I advised her she should have considered this before turning around behind my back, and that none of my concern was what her parents chose to do, saying I shouldn't have dragged her parents into our marital troubles since now her life was shattered, and she had nobody left. She labeled me immature and petty. I hung up on her and replied I couldn't care less. She then started texting me endlessly, calling every name under the sun, threatening to steal every dollar I had and cause me to repent everything. My father-in-law called me as well. He apologized to me for what his daughter had done. He was embarrassed of her. Hoping this would teach her a lesson, he informed me they were done letting her get away with anything. I was more than glad to provide him with the doctor's reports he requested. That was a couple hours ago, and my wife keeps contacting me. I'm thinking about just blocking her, but somewhere in the back of my mind, there is a niggling voice reminding me I might have gone too far and ought to have kept this between the two of us. Although I absolutely have second thoughts about the divorce, and I don't regret shutting her out of my apartment, I realize what a major blow it is to her to be cut off from her parents. Am I the expletive for telling my in-laws about my wife's adultery and abortion? Update 1. I want to thank everyone who helped me. Those of you who shared your own tales made me feel far less alone than I was feeling and also helped me relax about my response. Working through the divorce has not been simple. She is determined about receiving alimony and won't help me. We all know how complicated divorces can go. Thus, we have been trying to come to an understanding between us and avoid going to court. Unfortunately, it looks like she is handling this as an assault against her ego and does not give practicalities any thought. I am quite happy I had the wisdom to evict her from the apartment before she could get the pregnancy test and ultrasonic records, which I currently have with me. I have also discussed the overall matter with Darren. Though I am furious with him, he claims he will help and even testify if he has to. He has also blocked my wife on all conceivable platforms and avoided all interaction with her. He has apologized for what he did. Not that his apology counts to me, but at least he isn't repeating her error as she did. Curiosity drove me to ask him specifics about the affair. He claimed it began the weekend I visited Paris and persisted for as long as he remained here. Reportedly, they also met a few times after he moved out. Regarding her pregnancy or abortion, he claimed he knew nothing. Though I am furious with him, I do need him to respond appropriately should things get that far off. Knowing that he depends on my dad financially, his funds have gone out. I also realize the only reason he is suddenly so thoughtful of my needs is clearly my dad will be cut off completely should he exacerbate the problem in any form. According to my dad, Darren's lack of immediate cutoff is just a result of our maybe need for him should the divorce get messy. It hasn't been easy. I'm trying as hard as I can not to let me snap at him. Apart from that, I have moved into my apartment. Otherwise, there is not any more positive news as yet. I cannot pretend to be sympathetic. I know exactly where she is. I am not likely to lose this flat, as I have owned it for considerably longer than my marriage has lasted. For now, just that is all. I am preparing for the divorce to get more ugly. I have no other option. Once things calm down enough, I'll attempt to let you know, people. Update 2. I am formally divorcing you people. My last update was 6 months ago. Hence I have been really busy. Things have advanced with the divorce since then. Originally, challenging my wife changed her behavior following multiple pretrial hearings, depositions, and settlement negotiations. It became evident that if we let this go to trial, Darren answered under oath already. We had proof of her pregnancy for her statement. We called in our Abjin. She supported us on everything, especially exposing where the depositions. My wife had to respond to some difficult questions under oath, and her behavior, along with the contradictions, only worked against her. Darren's deposition validated our suspicions. Although his apologies meant nothing to me, it was an important piece of proof on his phone. They also foolishly snapped some images in private situations during the encounter. She could not later on ignore the reality. We traveled to settlement conferences following the depositions. These were uncomfortable, but given her high-paying work and the strong proof of her infidelity, my wife's lawyers seemed to understand that pursuing alimony wouldn't be successful. Her request for alimony clearly wouldn't stand up in court. While we were ready to resolve things amicably, I wasn't going to be taken advantage of. My wife gave up at last. She committed herself to not claiming any alimony, given her efforts during our marriage. The settlement also guaranteed that she would not get any more than what we decided upon. This was fair. I'm happy the last decision was taken without calling for a pointless trial that would have simply sapped my funds and time. She will have her own stuff. We have fairly split our shared assets. The settlement guarantees our ability to go on free from more entanglement. Though I am glad everything is over now, I cannot help but feel as though all of this has been a great waste of my time. Not only the divorce, but the entire marriage. I find it hard to believe I squandered time and effort and strayed from my intentions to start a family for someone who would not hesitate to toss it all aside for basically nothing. I appreciate your support and counsel all around. It has been really helpful at this difficult period. If someone else is experiencing something like this, keep strong and rely on your support system. Things will improve. Update 3. Although I'm not sure whether anyone is still interested, I wrote in this subreddit at the start of the year, and it has been a few months since my last update. I heard from my dad a few hours ago. Not expecting much, I picked up and was genuinely perplexed about how to respond when he told me Darren and my ex-wife apparently are seeing one another once more. I hadn't heard from any of them and didn't realize Darren came to the city after finding employment here. I suppose it was sufficient to reignite their love, and she apparently forgot all the slights she had aimed at him during the divorce. I get turned off. I feel duped, in that someone made a fool of me. According to my dad, he has made it abundantly evident to Darren and my stepmother that he wants nothing to do with him going forward. At least having my old dad by my side feels great. Still, that is that. I don't think I will have any more updates for you folks, as I hope I won't hear anything about this anymore. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.